got models and lips and sipping. I see all these models that's good for a while. I put something different, do it different. You on a mission, and it's smoking and hot and it's busy. Then got so drunk I lost in the vision, blacking out like I'm in a submission.
No, but it's like, it's a long story. I'm getting old. I'm going to talk about you guys publicly, or is that sick?
Yeah,
I wasn't 100% sure as well. Yeah. Yeah, I think so.
Cool. Good. Yeah. I can do the intro if you want, mate. Howdy. Welcome back, everyone. Hope everyone had a good feed. So the thing I absolutely love about conferences like this is that I get to hang out with all my friends. This is great. All right. So I've always wanted to say this. My next speaker needs no introduction. So Casey is the chairman, founder, and CTO of Bugcrowd, and a co-founder of Disclose.io project. He has 20 plus. He is a 20+ year veteran of information security as a career, and has been inventing stuff and generally getting technology to do things it wasn't supposed to do since early childhood. So nice one. I'm sure there are many stories there. So professionally, he has worn a variety of hats, working as a pen tester, security and risk consultant, and solutions architect, CSO, and then most recently as a career in entrepreneur and a company leader. Casey pioneered the crowdsourced security as a service model, launching the first bug bounty program on the Bugcrowd platform in 2012. Wow, where does the time go? And co-founded the Disclose.io vulnerability disclosure standardization project in 2014. So Casey's going to be talking about the unlikely romance, crowdsourced security from a financial services perspective. So can we give a very warm round of applause for Mr. Casey Ellis? How we doing? Is lunch good? Yeah? Y'all awake? All right, rock and roll. Let's do it. Thank you for that. That was awesome. I love that too. I think being back in Australia, being just IRL in general has been a treat. It's been too long, so I echo those sentiments there. Thank you to AusCERT, Beck, Mike, Laura, the rest of the crew for inviting us, and happy 20th anniversary. It's a big week, and that's kind of cool as well. I still remember my first AusCERT as a solution architect. And it's interesting to see what's changed and what's stayed the same. It's still an incredible conference, which is great. So yeah, as Cynic kind of went through, what we're talking about, there's a talk I've done for a while called Inside the Unlikely Romance. It's this whole idea that like hackers and organizations playing nice is a little bit like dogs and cats, living together. And it's a counterintuitive concept to people that haven't really thought it through. So I've got a talk that basically sets that up. This is with the bent of the more conservative industries that are out there. So financial services is one example. I'll go through some of the others in a little bit, but that's kind of the idea of it. Because I think our model, it was kicked off from Silicon Valley. It's known as this kind of crazy tech company thing to do. A lot's happened since then, so I'm going to unpack some of that. Who am I? So I started off in a collared shirt this morning. I'm slowly morphing back into my hoodie's in the dry cleaners is the joke I put out on Twitter this morning. But there is the hack persona and the hustle persona as a company leader, as a board leader, all of those different things. That's the business guy, and very much a technologist. That was my origin. That's still what I try to get back to. I think the older I get, the better I was, but I still give it a good shot, right? And really, I think the introductions kind of said everything. The one bit is lives in San Francisco, lives in I don't really know. We actually came back to Australia from the US in March of last year ahead of COVID. We haven't returned yet. Looking forward to doing that, but it's been an interesting 18 months or so for all of us, and that definitely includes me and my family. So just as a shout out for those online and those in the room, we've got a landing page for this talk. If you want to go on there, play with the platform, sign up as a researcher on the hacking side, as a customer potentially on the demand side, that's where you can go to do that. We've also got a virtual booth with all the goodies and all that sort of stuff. So I wanted to make sure I give that a shout out. Plus, I'll be around. I'm not quite sure how you do swag distribution in a COVID-safe world, but I brought stickers and did all that sort of stuff. I'll be swanning around the conference. So if anyone wants to come up and say hello afterwards or during the con, feel free to just grab me and say hello. I'm always happy to have a chat. All right, so agenda. Let's talk about how we got here. Like, what's the progress of this industry? How did we get here, especially with respect to financial services and the kind of organizations that you wouldn't necessarily expect to be running a bug bounty program or do any kind of crowdsourcing or multi-sourcing? Like, what's the journey of that looked like? A couple of war stories, kind of my broke versus woke hot take section in terms of how thinking about all of this stuff has progressed and some ideas about how to go forward, and then Q&A. On the Q&A side, I love being able to hear what y'all have in mind that you're wanting to learn. So, make use of the app. We can do just random yelling at the end of this session as well. All right, so we're good to go? Yeah? Rousing. Come on, people, wake up. I know it's just after lunch, but it's all good. Okay, so when, as I mentioned, when we first started, the concept of crowdsourcing, the concept of hackers as a help, not just a harm, really was birthed out of the technology industry. When we started Bugcrowd, one of the first things I wanted to do was to basically have it jump out of the sandpit, right? Silicon Valley is interesting in that it's kind of the lunatics validating the asylum in a lot of ways. You got all of these early adopters that are doing stuff and then selling it to themselves. And that's good because it's usually how things are going to look in the future. But until you break it out of that space and make it relevant to industries that are more ubiquitous, you haven't really, in my mind, proven your concept until that point. So we set out to do that. So let's go after the oldest financial services organization, pretty much in the planet. The joke was at the time that Western Union is probably older than America itself, which could be true, might not be. But it was one of these organizations where if you looked at them doing this type of thing, it's like, that's interesting. I thought that was just a Facebook thing. Now they're doing it. I'm intrigued. The introduction to them was really actually through, we started to talk to them about the whole model. What they actually had was literally an extortion attempt. So someone had a vulnerability. This is not like big bounty or people doing that sort of thing. It was straight up, flat out extortion. Like, pay us money, otherwise we're going to exploit this phone, drop it on the internet, all that sort of thing. So they called us saying, well, you speak hacker, like how do we do this? We basically helped them out of that situation. They then went on to start a private program, and in March 2015, they became the first publicly traded financial services company with a public bug bounty program, which was pretty great. Like at that point in time, that was a revolutionary idea that an organization like that would even entertain this idea in the first place. And I think it helped Bugcrowd along, but I think it helped the whole model and the whole industry along at the same time. So fast forward to today. Really, financial services is a substantial chunk of our business. It's a substantial chunk of the people that are going out and working out their own ways, be it through vuln disclosure, through whatever else, finding ways to basically engage the help that's outside the four walls of their organization to help them stay safe. One of the things that we saw last year was that COVID drove huge acceleration for us in this market as a business, primarily because of the bricks and mortar aspect that kind of went away. So you had all these like digital transformation projects that were planned for 2022 that were all of a sudden planned for June. How do you secure that stuff? Like we can scale into that. So they definitely picked up the pace there. I think with this whole model, and for us, we often find ourselves at the top of a CISO's ROI stack ranking. And this is something that we actually try to go out and do objectively. So much so that the CISO of NAB just joined us over the past couple of months. So NAB's been a customer. They were an early adopter in the Australian market in FinServ as well. Started privately and then worked their way out to more public and more exposed programs. At this point, they're doing pretty much everything that we do in some form or fashion. Nick saw that and thought, okay, this is really, this is going to be an inevitable part of how we do at least some aspects of security in the future. I want to be a part of it. So we're pretty stoked to have him aboard. And why did he do that? I think it comes back to the fundamentals of what we're trying to get done here. Like those of you who are in the panel this morning would have heard me say, I fundamentally believe that cybersecurity is a human problem. The tech just makes it go faster, right? So we end up in this position where you can kind of see it here. You've got the baddies on one side, and we don't know how many of them there are, what they're capable of, why they're pulling on the rope in the first place, but we know they are there. Then there's the computer, which is the battleground, and whoever is employed and usually paid by the hour to try to fight back. The thing of it is that person can be brilliant. It's actually the math that's the problem. It's the idea that there's an imbalance of forces, there's an imbalance of resourcing and creativity that could be applied. And meanwhile, you've got the white hat community standing around. Those of you who are from the hacker space, like we've been trying to help for the last 30 odd years. We've never really gotten a seat at the table until the last 10 or so. So that's really, I think something that I'm quite chuffed about with this whole thing and how it's all progressed. But really, this is why people like Nick at this point in time are looking at it saying that's actually the future, because honestly, like we're not going to solve all this with automation. We're not going to solve all of this with the people that we hire, regardless of how smart we are. We need to level the playing field, right? And really, I think the other thing that's happening alongside that is the CISO, the actual role of the CISOs in the process still of being defined. I see this all around the world, definitely in Australia. It's also true in the US, in other parts of the world where, okay, we've got this security person in the boardroom now. We don't really know why they're here other than the fact that they should be. They're still trying to figure out how to be here and how to interface with the rest of the business. What's up here? And that's starting to be formed, right? The way I see it is this almost this balancing act, three-way balancing act between the business and financial side, the political side, which includes marketing, like internally and externally, and then this technical side. And oftentimes you get 2 out of the 3. Finding all 3 in the one person is kind of hard, right? And that's just a human thing. So oftentimes you get 2 out of the 3. Oftentimes there's technical, basically debt in the ability to actually answer these questions and guide the business. And again, it's not the fault of the people that are involved. It's just a hard problem to solve. So how do we backfill that? Something that we spend a lot of time talking about and educating on within Bugcrowd is what's the hacker's response to that? Because in this space, you've got this very broad variety of degrees of professionalism, people even understanding what that means in the first place. And there's education involved. Rookies who come in, like, what does it look like to wear a suit and tie to work sometimes? Because you don't have to do that, but understanding that that's a thing is going to help you. It's going to be pretty important and useful in your career. So the whole idea of you switch between these two, you've got those kind of 3 sections for the CISO and then the corresponding sides for the community. That's a big part of what we've been trying to educate and seeing, honestly, at this point in time, the hacker community actually have a growing appetite for. So if you go out and look at the content that's being generated, half of it's on how to build a career and how to speak suit, literally, which is, I think, a really, really good thing. The tech stuff's already there. Like if people are in this space in the first place, they're going to figure that stuff out themselves. This is the hard bit that they probably don't intuitively understand. So the fact that there's gravity in that direction, I think, is a really good thing. So when we've gone out and talked to these industries, financial services is one. We've done work. We've been working with the Department of Defense in the US for the last 6 or 7 years at this point. Other sort of similar verticals where again, you're like, if Facebook's up one end, these folk are at the other end of that spectrum, right? And ask them, like, what's the problems that you've got that we can potentially help solve? These are the 3 that have come back most reliably. Like, can't find the right people to do the work. I've got tooling that's fragmented and it's inadequate if you're talking about having it compete creatively with an adversary. And my workflows are kind of disjointed, right? So really what we did as an organization is build a platform to plug everything in. So the idea behind Bugcrowd was really the latent potential that exists in the white hat community and then this growing problem of cyber just in general. How do we plug that in? Because that seems like a logical thing to do. That's really what we've been doing now for the last 10 years. Simple, right? There's a fair bit of devil in the detail, but that's the soup to nuts of it. In terms of the priorities that we're trying to help organizations solve, what we've heard them come to us with. So this is not, again, I'm stressing this because it's not like Bugcrowd's marketing, like we want to tell the market how you're thinking thing. This is actually off, studies that we've done, like research, like actually trying to dig into like what is most important, because there's so many things we can solve, like stack rank that stuff and tell us how we can best help. And these were the things that came up. Risk reduction is fairly obvious. It's not always a given, but it's high on the list. Improving time to market. So having security be as minimal a blocker to getting new things out to market as possible, and that's part of what we saw in 2020 with all this transformation stuff. We could scale to that because the community's there at the doorstep. It gives them the feedback they need without slowing them down. That's really important. Improving the ROI, which is critical, because security is one of those things where if it works, nothing happens. So the scrutiny on budget and on money that's being spent, I think it's always a thing, but I think in our space, the burden of proof on that's even higher. So that's a big one. And then contextual visibility, like how do I view a particular data point or a particular piece of input in light of my overall attack surface, my overall threat model, like the risks I'm dealing with, the assets that I have to protect. So really kind of where we've gone from here is from our origins, which was really talking about bug bounty, crowdsourced pen testing, those sorts of things, is to diversify out how we deliver that. So bug bounties in the traditional sense, vulnerability disclosure programs, which I'm an absolute nutter for. Like if you come up, ask for a sticker or whatever else later, you'll pick that up pretty quickly, because I believe that it's almost an issue of core corporate responsibility to have a way to receive security feedback from the internet. It's becoming like Neighborhood Watch, right? And it went from being this novel idea to a thing that just should be a thing. Pen testing, which is the one that surprises folk, that's actually where we started as an organization, but we've gone into different ways of delivering that, like crowdsourcing it, obviously moving into outsourcing and different things as well to be able to deliver that in ways that are more traditional to the user, and to be able to satisfy questions around assurance and so on. And then attack surface management, which I think is a really interesting one. I think the Asset Note folk are doing a talk here somewhere, and they'll say this, I'm not speaking out of school on this one, they got their origin or their kind of start from basically operating in a bug bounty model and realizing people don't know where their crap is. Here we are, like we've, all of a sudden the entire internet is potentially our attack surface, and our burden is to prove that thing over there is not mine. How do I do that at scale? That seems like an impossible problem. So there's all sorts of stuff around that. What we do is augment that with researchers that are focused particularly on that task. And just in terms of where we're up to, this is like the yay slide. 200 employees, 80 million raised, 170,000 or so vulnerabilities annihilated, 50 million paid out. About 200,000 signed up on the platform, of which about 10 to 15% are actually active at any given point in time. And thousands of programs of all sorts of different shapes and sizes. So I'm going to pause myself for a sec for some water. I'm feeling this speed up as I go along, so take a deliberate shift here. So what does this look like on the receiving end with a focus on conservative markets, right? This is the war story section. And it kind of introduces a concept that I've started to use a little bit, the idea of like research-driven assurance. Like when you think about traditional assurance, it's usually built on top of what people already know. There's folks that add research to that. But for the better part, that's not the norm. It's kind of the exception to the norm. For this model, we're deliberately drawing from people that are focused on research as how they do security assurance. So what happens when you plug that in? This one was fun. So AKA the Equifax vulnerability, it'll probably be forever known as that, and Struts 2 probably known as the thing that got Equifax owned, which is just the way it is because that was kind of a bad hack. So an organization that we were working with, they'd gone through and fixed Struts 2, and they thought they got it all dialed in. They'd missed a bunch of stuff. So Equifax itself was announced in July 2017. The compromise took place in May of 2017. We basically went out and found this stuff and told them about it in February. So we closed off that window in terms of organizations or adversaries that were looking for this particular exploit as a way to get in and do bad stuff to financial services organizations. We closed that window for them by 3 months, which was pretty cool. That was one of the ones, that was around a time when we were bringing a whole bunch of new people actually into Bugcrowd from a hiring standpoint. And it was like, whoa, okay, that was good. Like it was an internal proof point for the organization as much as it was for everyone else who's watching on. Another, like last year was a pretty interesting year, I think. There was a combination of increased focus from an adversarial research standpoint, and I think increased use of basically, vulnerabilities in public access and remote access systems. So Pulse, F5 Temui is the one I'm going to talk about here. There was a whole raft of others. There was actually an NSA advisory that came out, I think in November, that talked about NDAY in use by nation state actors. Like, why are they doing it? It's because it still works. Like, why would you burn a $500,000 capability when you can download something off ExploitDB and still get the job done? And that was a thing last year and continues to be so today. So with this particular one, what we saw was the advisory. So this was actually end day in terms of what we saw come out of the crowd. The patch came first, then the patch got reversed. We saw it come through the platform used in anger in the context of research-driven assurance. I think it was 2 days or 3 days before ExploitDB and some of those other places started publishing proof of concepts. So like that's another example of where there's this drift, and you can sort of see how the model kind of draws out what people are able to do, but then gets that information to the right place, which is the place where it can be actioned, right? This one was fun. It's I put this in the innovative technique bucket. So the idea of type confusion, that was earlier this year. We've actually seen that attack in the wild since December or so of 2020. Like variations of that, it got coalesced, written up into a paper, and all of a sudden everyone's talking about it. And I actually think this particular attack mode, we haven't seen the end of it, because it really kind of leans quite heavily on some of the assumptions that we have on supply chain security, which apparently this year is the year of the supply chain attack. So that's a consistent theme. Again, this research-driven approach to assurance found this stuff before it became widely known and therefore broadly exploitable, and it continues forward, today. We actually saw this happen in organizations that were able to take that information, fix the discrete issues that were pointed out. So you've got a problem with your NPM or your gems or whatever else. Basically, apply that concept across all of the different areas where that same type of issue might occur, and proactively defend against this type of attack, which was pretty cool. This is a fun one. This was actually really early in Bugcrowd. We had a Alexa Top 100 FinServ organization. They've been around on the internet for probably 20 years or more, the particular site that got owned. And what it was an XXE that could get pivoted across into SSRF, then got RCE in the backend server farm, at which point stop, and the person doing that and finding that and reporting it paused at that point. But the degree of privilege they actually had within that environment and the things that you could do from there was pretty dramatic and pretty extreme. It was a good bug. They got paid well for it. We like those. It's like, yeah, that one's really cool. The thing is that bug, we found out later, had probably been in play for about 5 years. They were able to go back, do IR burn down, see if there was any IOCs created through this kill chain that mapped up things that other people had done. Found that it hadn't, to their knowledge, been exploited, but it had been there exposed for about 5 years at that point. And the thing is that this is like Alexa Top 100. It's in the top 100 websites on the internet. It gets pen tested twice a year. That had been going on for 15 years, and this got missed. So that was a really interesting example of, when you've got that curiosity and that drive, and you've got that kind of skills being brought to bear to do this type of thing, like what actually pops out the other end. I think this is a really interesting one as well. So we got involved in the DoD Hack the Pentagon program early on in the piece, doing mostly private work. So there's the public side of that everyone knows about. The part people don't talk about as often is the private crowdsourcing piece. So with this, we're actually doing source code analysis, which is like, wait, what? You could do that? Yeah, we did. Environment testing, Azure testing, crowdsourced social engineering, which was really interesting. I thought it was quite brave of the DoD to try that, because it was definitely experimental. It's something that we've evolved since, but it worked. It was really effective. This is an environment, it was pre-production, but it was intended to be TSSCI as a compartment. So the fact that we were bouncing around on the inside of the thing, I think is pretty amazing. 54 vulns, 123 grand in rewards. Top reward for that one was 20 grand. There was a lot of stuff that fell out. It was already, as you can imagine, a fairly resilient environment because the Air Force are good at that kind of thing. But there was still a lot that was found. And to me, this is a proof point of the fact that, yeah, industries and conservative organizations, conservative verticals are starting to trust hackers, starting to trust security researchers more. That ultimately is a good thing. I think it's obviously great for Bugcrowd as a business. I think it's just a globally good thing to see happen. So there you go. How am I going on time? All right, so, and remember, questions, store them up. Let's have a chat at the end here. This is my broke versus woke. I think the thing that's been interesting about this space is that when you say bug bounty, everyone's got an opinion. They've got a particular mode of what it looks like in their head. They've got a particular opinion of what it's valuable for, how it works. And there's varying degrees of accuracy and truth in that. I'm not here to say that my point of view is the right one. But that is to say that words are hard in cybersecurity in general, I think, and just trying to kind of paint out some misconceptions and talk about different ways of thinking about stuff as we go forward. And this is cybersecurity as a space, but then particularly around research-driven assurance. So broke, this is more of an industry one. Rub some blockchain on it and it'll go away. Like we talked all about this morning in the panel. The idea is that cybersecurity is actually a people problem. The tech just makes it go faster. I think once the industry, and particularly executives that are outside of our space, catch that and actually grok that idea, all of a sudden a whole bunch of things get easier. You end up fighting less against the idea of the blinky box in the corner, solving all your problems. You can actually approach things through a risk lens and start to solve real problems. Broke. Vulnerability disclosure programs as a marketing stunt. This is something that still happens. We definitely saw it a lot early on. So people going out and saying, I want to get in TechCrunch, I'm going to start a VDP. And that was really the only reason they were doing it. I do think that the marketing benefit and the statement of transparency around a vulnerability disclosure program is a powerful thing. We actually did a lot of work with the EAC and the Department of Homeland Security in the US ahead of the 2020 election. To use VDP to basically not only find vulnerabilities in election systems, but try to bolster confidence in the voting population. That turned out to be pretty important. And I don't feel like we solved that problem, but we definitely moved the needle and actually, it got adopted, which I thought was phenomenal. Really, this is where I think the true power of a VDP stands out. It's this idea of to err is human. It's almost like an antidote for ostrich risk management within an organization, right? Where it's if we just pretend this thing doesn't exist, all of a sudden it won't be a problem for us. That's becoming increasingly obvious as something that isn't true. And this drives that point home. Okay, cool. We're admitting that we're not perfect. Turns out all humans are like that. So that's not actually a huge stretch. It's just businesses struggle with that leap, right? This is a vehicle for that. And I think it's another powerful idea. Broke, literally. Bug bounty is the silver bullet. The idea of basically going out, Katie Mazuris and I can get into tangles on different kind of aspects of detail. This is a particular point that we're in violent agreement about because a lot of people go out and say, cool, we've rubbed bounty on it and now it's fine. That's not true. You've got to do something with what people tell you. We have organizations come to us and say, I want to start a bug bounty tomorrow. Usually the answer will be, no, you don't. Let's put the brakes on for a second. What else are you doing for you to suddenly wake up the next day and go out and offer money to the internet for hacking your stuff? You have to be ready for that. So let's have that conversation first, right? You'd be amazed how often that happens. Bug bounty is a way to, the woke version is bug bounty is a way for the business to internalize the boogeyman's real. There's something profoundly impactful for an engineer, for a non-security person, about getting your code hacked by some random kid halfway across the world. It's different to when your red team does it. Because all of a sudden it's they're helpful and friendly and all of that. I wonder what their next door neighbor's like. Oh my God, this is possible. I think a lot of the time that internalization and that kind of baseline awareness of the fact that it does matter, we could clean up a lot of stuff if we just had that to work with universally within an organization. I think this is a really powerful way to help achieve that. Again, broke, literally. Total payouts is a vanity metric. You see organizations going out and saying, we paid out $100 million in the last quarter It's like, are you fixing stuff? Are you like actually getting better at not introducing vulnerabilities in the first place? I think there is a legitimate use case for it, and there's some organizations, a small number, that do this well. But to hold this up as the goal that everyone should aspire to, for starters, it's not economically rational for most organizations. For seconds, it kind of reinforces the wrong thing. So the woke version is required payout as a proxy for the cost to attack the company. We've seen actually organizations in Australia take this on. It's almost like the fireproof safe, right? Like if you yeet a fireproof safe into the sun, it's going to burn. It's not actually fireproof. So what you've got on the box is, your passport's going to survive for 6 hours at this temperature, and that's how fire resistant it is. So transport that across to this. We had, as an organization, we had a payout of $10,000. We saw a bunch of bugs come through. Then it started to calm down. And then we increased it to 20,000. Then that started to calm down. All of a sudden, you've got this basically trend line that you can show to a board because they understand dollar signs, right? That you're improving. This is actually a cost, a cost to attack the business in a white hat context, granted, but it's still, I think, a holistic metric that's actually quite powerful and tells the story of why we're all here. Like fundamentally, we're here to make it harder for the bad guys, right? So, all right, if you've got data to actually support the fact that that's working, that's a pretty powerful thing to be able to use. Broke, pen test as an assurance-only model. So this is the tick and flick problem, right? I think the idea of being able to run through a list of things and say that you did it, there's a legitimate use case for it. I prefer it when it's done well. We actually now do this and bring alongside it competitive testing and matching and all these different sorts of things to be able to maximize our ability to identify risk in that process. But I think historically, pen tests, for the better part, we've been able to get away with it in the market collectively as just something that a wizard of the dark arts does. You get paid a lot of money for, and then you go flip to another vendor next year. I think that's a waste of effort, frankly, like for the better part. The woke version of that is, okay, let's do assurance, but let's also optimize for impact. I want to know about the risks that I have that I'm not aware of. I want to know the unknown unknowns. How do I get to those, right? And in doing that, you create feedback loops between builders and breakers. So again, it's the engineers and the people that are deploying the attack surface. How do you get them not becoming like an offensive security expert necessarily, but just thinking more about how it works? Like that's a huge lift if you can execute on that. This is a fun one. This is a recent addition to this list. Because really SolarWinds was, there was confirmed activity and narratives around a certain fairly small set of agencies. But in reality, they got shells on tens of thousands of different organizations. I think that's a new idea for most folk. So you've got the Mossad, not Mossad threat model. James Mickens from Microsoft came up with that. That's still true. But here we are, like noticing changes in the behavior of APT that's basically spray and pray, get shells wherever you can in the hope or in the model of being flexible enough to use them later. That's a new thing for us to think about, right? So really what that provokes is this idea of how do I detect and contain a nation state assuming they're successful? How do I just directionally, assuming that's impossible to fully solve, but how do I align with that as a North Star, at least to some degree, and start moving in that direction? Because that's probably going to be a thing at some point in the future. I think that's a really important one. And again, a new one. And broke, for all the security researchers in the audience who've experienced this, piping security at emails or kind of security input that comes in from the outside world to dev null. On the finder side, actually trying to help out an organization that's not ready for your help and then having it be a black hole, that's a really disenchanting experience. Depending on your degree of professionalism, you see some people actually act out after that happens. For the better part, it's just kind of a bummer. So, I think there's leverage in getting good at this. The woke version of that is standardize it. Let's view VDP, let's view a relationship between organizations and people that are trying to give us security feedback is just a normal part of being on the internet. What we've done, a group of people, this is something that I've been involved in for a long time. There's DHS, DOD, GitHub, Rapid7, all of these different organizations that have people from them that contribute to this and make these things more effective over time. It's standardization of legal language. So if anyone's tried to actually talk a lawyer through how to stand up a vulnerability disclosure policy, it's... and the problem with lawyers, and this is their job, right? So I'm actually not faulting them for this. When they're uncertain or ambiguous, they'll tend towards verbosity. So you end up with like War and Peace. Meanwhile, you've got someone on the internet who is not a lawyer, possibly doesn't even speak English as a first language, and you're asking them to actually read that stuff before they engage. That's just not going to work. So really what we tried to do here is simplify all of that, reduce the friction, and then coming around the top of that, how do we reduce it even to the point where it's like literally a green padlock or the equivalent to that, so that anyone can look at an organization and say, okay, I get what they're doing. They've got like neighborhood watch for the internet. This is cool. So that's what that is. If you want to get involved, ping us, it's open source, all of those different things. So really, in summary, it takes an army to outsmart an army. I think we're all kind of pretty aware of that. But demonstrating the fact that that's true was part of the intent of this talk. The community's at the table, it's ready to help. There is tremendous leverage available for those who think differently, actually find ways to engage with stuff like this. And your customers are starting to expect this. I think it's over time going to become more of a thing that's just like, wait, you don't have that? Signing off with our patron saint, Grace Hopper, a ship important safe is safe, but that's not what ships are for. And I think if we can engage that in terms of how we try to solve big cybersecurity problems, we're on the right track. Thank you.
Thank you. Right, we have a few questions on the app via the Q&A button. So they are somewhat related, but I'll read out each one of them. So
Sure.
The top scored one was, how do you pitch a VDP to execs who believe that starting a program will make the company a target? In quotes, or in brackets, avoiding the head in the sand mentality.
Yeah. My tongue-in-cheek answer I usually give to that is show them your logs, because it's kind of already happening. They're just not getting the report. So and there's an element of truth in that. You're not always going to have a receptive executive to that particular approach. I think that's what I was getting at with what we did with the election stuff in the US. It's actually turning this into almost a virtue signal, but like a real one. So it's like, this is a thing that we as an organization can go out and tell our customers that we're doing, that they can understand. Like, that's the beauty of VDP. You talk about EDR or all of SOAR, SIEM, all of these different things. Grandma probably doesn't get it. But if you talk about neighborhood watch for the internet, oh, okay, I kind of understand what's going on there. So to be able to help them sell it to themselves internally and then actually use that as a way to promote the business, that's a pretty effective way to do it.
Yeah, definitely. And maybe something like metrics as well, and show them the internet, and they were like, wow, okay, well, there's a lot of bad people out there. Why don't we just close down?
It's a bad neighborhood, as it turns out.
And the second question is related, but I'll let you decide.
Sure.
What advice would you give companies trying to roll out their own VDP because they don't have management support to use services like yours?
Got it. That's honestly part of the reason we, the people that came together. So Disclose.io was partly a product of a law firm out of DC, partly out of the Berkeley University. A whole bunch of other people kind of coalesced into this initiative. NTIA, DOJ, like they're all kind of triangulating around this idea of like, how do we help people just do this? Start there, honestly, because I think the legal part, using that as a tool of alignment within the organization to actually understand what the hell you're about to do, that's a pretty important step. I think beyond that, it really is, just make sure there's stakeholder alignment internally. Make sure that whatever you're putting out on the internet are a set of commitments that you can follow through on. Don't over promise and under deliver, because that, it's one of those things that you just don't want to do in this space. And if you put the work in, it's achievable. Bugcrowd's role in doing that is to help companies make that easy, help them set it up successfully, do it well. I'm honestly a huge fan of when folk do it themselves, even though we don't get the deal necessarily, because it's just something that should happen on the internet. And the rest of what we do kind of benefits as a byproduct anyway. So yeah, that would be my advice.
Oh, thank you for that. Now, there are no more questions on the app, but are there any questions on the floor? I can just run around and get my steps up.
Don't be shy.
Oh, one, yes.
So you talked about this year being the year of the software supply chain attacks.
Yeah.
I mean, that's pretty difficult for a platform like Bugcrowd because you can't just have your entire software supply chain in scope for a program like that. But is, Bugcrowd starting to look at that at all?
Yeah, and you're right. Like, I think you're right in terms of the entire software supply chain because it's literally turtles all the way down at this point in most verticals. So there's just a lot of stuff. You'd have to look at the entire internet to feel like you've covered it off to 100%. Where I'd push back on that a little bit is, in context of scope and different things like that, people will remove dynamic systems that they're not authorized to allow testing on behalf of the owner. They'll take that stuff out because that's, you don't want to encourage violation of CFAA or whatever else, right? But oftentimes it's the interactions that'll still surface and actually find or demonstrate things that need to be fixed anyway. So in a way, it's kind of already happening just by observation of those relationships and those different things. I think, going forward, again, this idea of just basically making vulnerability disclosure and this idea of research as being good, ubiquitous, in terms of open source, you've got more at that point hackers looking at open source projects and saying, hey, there's a problem there. Like, can I help you fix it? Because usually it's like 2.5 people and a cat maintaining like half of something that powers half the internet. That's like status quo in open source. So that part's hard too. There's a bunch of different people working on that. Like Bugcrowd's looking at that in terms of doing it proactively. We do that with OEMs all the time. So automotive industry, for example, there's examples there. It's a really dense question because you have to basically answer the question of what is the supply chain first. And the answer to that is like, no one really knows. So extending it out to as much of the risk that affects an organization as possible, and then by extension, the internet as possible, that's ultimately our goal. So we're continually pushing in that direction.
Cool, thank you. Great question. Any other questions on the floor? Got plenty of time. Oh, one more.
Going again?
So working with the DoD,
Yeah.
they're an interesting crowd, very secretive. What was it like actually getting into that space, but then also getting your researchers approved to work in that space?
Good question. Yeah, so the folks that actually drove that initiative were a group called the Defense Digital Services Group, which are essentially the digital transformation arm of the DoD. So it's a bunch of like technologists who also have, a military or service background, pretty much commissioned to go out and be a pain in the butt and like drag everyone else into the future. That was sort of their job, and they chose to start with this. So I think that there's a key in that. Like there was an internal set of stakeholders that really believed in the fact that it was a good thing, and they were just pushing it and pushing and pushing and pushing, and eventually it worked. I think that same principle, we've seen that apply in corporate, we've seen it apply in financial services. Actually, it was the same story for Western Union. It was their transformation group that brought us in the first place. So it's not an uncommon thing. Like organizations that are that old, and in the case of DoD, like with that sort of tendency to be conservative and kind of close to the chest in how they operate, they've got naturally more inertia to overcome to get an idea like this off the ground than others do, than Facebook or a 20-person startup. But there are ways to get it done. So that's really how we've seen that work on the adoption side. On the hacker side, it's the way that we've done it is like across that 200,000 or so member list that I called out before. It's basically a spectrum of trust. So on the bottom, you've got folk we don't even really know who you are, and we actually don't have to because it's a public program. So if you're just submitting an issue, the people running that program don't actually care about trust in the same way as the Air Force would, right? So at the top, you got those guys. That came down to basically sovereignty and clearance. There was some degree of clearance requirement. The other thing that we're doing as Bugcrowd is understanding behaviorally, like how professional are you? Like if we ask you to do a certain set of things, are you gonna because that's not always, the answer to that's not always yes in the hacker community. So we have to figure out who's who and match the right people in. And it was a success in that program, which is part of why I talk about it. It's one of those ones where it's like, wow, you pulled that off. That's amazing. but it did work. So yeah.
Cool. And that's all we've got time for. So thank you very much,
Cool.
Mr.
Thank you very
Casey
much.
Ellis.
Yes. Yay.